This is World Rally Championship 10 running on a regular base PlayStation 4. It runs at 30 frames per second. It runs at a native 1080p resolution, and overall, it looks rather nice. A game with satisfying car handling, vehicle deformation, dynamic weather, and some accurate material work. Released in September 2021 for PlayStation and Xbox systems, with next-gen PS5 and Series X support too, WRC 10 is a pure rally simulator. It's a game that sets you loose, alone on a fixed route, no real-time competition, just you, the track, and a stopwatch, drifting through the snowy climbs of Monte Carlo, the dusts of the Acropolis Rally, the plains of Nigeria, or the German countryside. Everything you've seen so far is the PS4 version, but this is the new WRC 10 port on Nintendo Switch. Released 6 months later in March 2022, clearly a lot sacrificed in visual quality. In fact, it's among the most heavily cut back Switch releases I've seen in recent memory. But is WRC 10 for Switch really as bad as people say it is? In visual comparisons, is it compromised too much, or is it still serviceable for a handheld release? And do the trade-offs pave the way to at least a smooth frame rate on Switch? Let's find out. Let's start with the headline here, the visuals. Yes, Switch makes a pretty hard cut on everything in sight, especially next to a base PS4, which I'll use today as a point of comparison. Image quality takes an obvious hit, and so resolution-wise, PS4 typically runs at a native 1920x1080, with temporal anti-aliasing to smooth over any lingering rough edges. As for Switch, well, that gets chopped to a dynamic 1600x900 for docked TV play. In truth, it rarely actually sticks to 900p though. The car exhibition mode, for example, runs natively at 720p instead, and most often, Switch is rendering at 1152x648 for the Germany and Japan stages, and even the camera mode. At 648p, the upscale to a full HD TV isn't exactly flattering, and for Switch portable play, it goes lower still to match the drop in GPU clocks. The most typical number there being 854x480. Potentially it could rise to 720p in handheld mode, but 480p is the typical figure there. Now portable or docked, regardless of how you play, Switch has very little effective anti-aliasing in place to address those jagged edges, besides an optional motion blur in the menus. Resolution then. Yes, it's the expected trade next to PS4. In comparison though, the cutbacks go way beyond pixel counts. It's almost impossible to list out everything in side-by-sides, given there's just so many changes, but for a start, texture quality is dropped to the bare minimum on terrain, leaving some glaringly low-resolution assets right in view. The pre-race flybys don't really do too much to hide them. Impressively, all crowds on the track side are in full 3D on Switch at least. You'll see the actual density of crowds is lower than PS4 overall, but still, they animate fully as you hurtle by. Just don't look too close at their finer details in photo mode. It all gets a bit PS1 era. Just see what a great time Larry's having here. And what about Bernard in his sunglasses? Even Voldemort's turned up. Okay, in fairness, none of this really notices emotion. That said, other aspects certainly do, like the reflections, which take a big hit next to PS4 here. Screen space reflections are chopped out entirely on Switch, and so any stages with rain-soaked roads or big water bodies end up looking bare, with no fallback method for mirroring the scenery around it. Shadows, too, are a big reason why the Switch rendition looks so barren in so many shots. Cars, trees, power lines all have shadows, though in practice they render as a kind of flickering mass of pixels under the car body. It's the bare minimum setting and looks rough in motion. Outside of that, plants appear without any form of shading in the distance, there's no ambient occlusion either, everything to the horizon looks plain as a result, two-dimensional, and the final picture is more barren on the Switch side. Without a doubt, the biggest cutback is in the terrain itself. The extent of the chop varies by track, but the worst offender is this first tutorial stage. Honestly, it looks almost unrecognizable in side-by-sides with PS4. Entire chunks of tree life are yanked out of the scene entirely to save on Switch's GPU. And tellingly, it's this tutorial stage that gets Switch closest to a 900p target as a result. The detail cutbacks here have a kind of positive trade in image quality. Still, it's clear this isn't the same beast as PS4. Other stages, meanwhile, trim back detail aggressively, if not quite to the same extent. The Croatia route, for example, misses trees in the valleys ahead, bushes, fences too. So many decorative elements filling the space are stripped outright. At the very least, this stage and the Acropolis route are identifiable as the same place between PS4 and Switch, but yes, it's a stark downgrade you'll have to accept going in. On the plus side, far distant detail like woodlands are nicely filled out even on Switch. There's density at the far range that completes the scene, even if it misses out effects like mist and dust present on PS4. All round, it's stunning to see how greatly WRC 10's engine scales. All signs point to a project that really targeted higher-end consoles, and then, for Switch, most settings get pared back to practically the lowest presets to hit 30 FPS. Some areas look fine. The Acropolis stage is actually a real highlight and looks comparable in overall foliage detail. Other stages, well, they have pretty glaring limits. Pop-in is also a huge issue universally. Geometry pops in with a hard snap ahead of the car, while baked shadow maps fade in meters ahead of play. Actual polygon counts are aggressively dialed back on Switch too, like this rocky outcrop in Monte Carlo. It's a completely different design, again resorting to what appears to be a bare minimum LOD. Okay, it's easy to pick out issues with the game's visuals, but that doesn't paint the whole picture. There is some good stuff here in WRC 10, and I've got to say it, the car models are impressively detailed. The game has among the better car models I've seen in a Switch racing sim. So much so, they're shown off in a dedicated exhibition mode. Material work on each car body is well handled, with crisp, high-resolution textures for liveries lacquered over with a glossy varnish that reflects the light above. Just check out the way light bounces off the blue paint coat of our Alpine Berlinette. It goes way beyond what we'd expect on Switch. Sure, car shadows and reflections are a step down from PS4, but the car body itself is nicely detailed, right down to the opaque tinted glass of the headlights and the hubcaps. Sadly, physics deformation is greatly minimized in actual races on Switch. That's the caveat, cars don't crumple on impact as they do on PS4, but Switch does retain scratch and dirt build-up during a race. It's a shame not to see the full simulation then, but clearly it's a trade that had to be made. On the surface, the visuals take a big hit for Switch, no question. But as for the core mechanics, the driving model, Nintendo's handheld is mostly fully featured. A proper cockpit view is included, allowing for movable parts like hand grips on the steering wheel, wind wipers, even reflections on side mirrors work, albeit at a low frame rate. You get different time of day states, you get dynamic weather, and headlights work to light the scenery at night too. Also, sound quality for engine revs and the co-driver are presented at a high bitrate. So often we see sound compressed down on Switch ports, notably in Assassin's Creed games, to help reduce the game size and CPU load. Here though, audio in WRC 10 presents as crisp and clear as you'd expect, which is great.
And left 5 and right 3 into left 3, 15.
So, is the Switch version playable? Visual cutbacks aside, is it feature complete? Well, there is some bad news here. Sadly, Switch has no online multiplayer to speak of. In fact, there isn't any multiplayer, even local. It's all removed from the menus. Switch does get the career mode, however, and the solo modes and tracks appear intact. Another big issue playing on Nintendo's handheld is, well, the controls. Switch has no analog triggers on the Joy-Cons, or the Pro Controller for that matter, and as such, it severely limits the ability to control a racing sim like WRC 10. The precision needed to judge a turn is gone to modulate the throttle. The need to feather the brake and acceleration just enough to maintain momentum but still clear a corner demands fine degrees of input. It needs analog triggers. What we have on Switch though is an on-off toggle for acceleration and braking instead, and it just isn't enough. Now, I found a workaround for this. You're able to reassign acceleration to the right analog stick, which does map acceleration correctly. With this tweak, WRC 10 on Switch becomes infinitely more playable and might just work for you as well. Putting Switch aside for a moment, I had time to check out the NextGen PS5 app too, as a kind of quick example of next-gen support. With PS4 and Switch being limited to 30 FPS, the real plus point on next-gen is in the upgrade to 60 FPS and even 120 FPS on supporting displays. In PS5's case, we get 3 modes: a 30 FPS high visual quality mode, typically running at a native 4K. Next, there's a 60 FPS balanced mode, running at a more dynamic resolution between 1620p and a full 4K, with dropped shadow quality too. And then lastly, we have a 120Hz performance mode, dropping shadow settings even further and rendering at 1080p. Between all 3 modes, the main difference really is in resolution and shadow quality. And if we look purely at the 4K 30fps quality mode on PS5, the upgrade over the last gen PS4 mostly relates to draw distances and shadow resolution. In a 3-way comparison, there's no contest with Switch here, obviously, but again it just shows how scalable the engine is. I will say, one other major advantage for upgrading to PS5 over PS4 is in loading times. Jumping into the Monte Carlo stage, for example, it takes just 7 seconds on PS5. The wait is much longer on a base PS4 using a stock HDD, taking around 36 seconds, and then Switch eventually loads in at the 42-second mark. Most stages I've tried give very similar results to these. 7, 36, and then 42 seconds seems to be the rollout. To be honest, loading times on PS4 and Switch are a frustration. Just to get to a race is quite a wait, and then it takes another loading screen to get back to the menus, which are especially lengthy on Switch. So again, loading times are a huge plus to moving to the new generation, that is alongside the leap to 60 FPS and beyond. Performance then, how does it stack up? Let's focus on Switch first. Looking at docked TV play, for all the drops in Switch's visual settings, in geometry, shadows, textures and more, at the very least 30 FPS performance is usually solid. I say usually, most stages hold a stable 30 FPS most of the way through, even with big crowds in view. The outliers, well, they appear to be the Japan and Germany stages, which drop to 25 FPS and under with too much complex geometry on screen. Check out this cliffside descent on the Shitara stage. The drop here is pretty extended and sticks out in motion just as you hit this tight corner. Frame pacing also becomes uneven if slightly once the performance drops, but it's trivial really. On average, most stages are playable enough at 30 FPS on Switch, but do expect chunks of a rally to potentially go to the low 20s as well. Portable play analysis is next, especially so for ambitious ports like this. Having a way to play handheld is the unique selling point. In reality, WRC 10 running at a native 480p while portable is a heavy hit to image quality, but you'd hope it's all in the name of improving performance, the 30 FPS cap. Sadly, the downside to playing handheld is that frame rates are worse than docked play. Just looking at the Monte Carlo stage, for example, we get 25 FPS from the starting line, where docked play holds at 30 FPS in the exact same spot. Likewise, we see new drops on the Acropolis stage. Again, playing on the small screen makes it less perceptible in motion, but it's hardly ideal. Expect a 30 FPS line in most stages, though yes, drops are more likely to happen in portable mode and heavier too. Jumping over to PS4 next, our prospects improve quite a bit. Optimization for the dedicated home consoles is much more robust than Switch. It's still 30 FPS as a target, yes, but it's practically perfect outside of some screen tearing. Usually you'll spot a little flash of tearing on hard corners or with too much dust buildup around the car, but it's generally quite solid. Moving up to PS5 then, on its own high visual quality 30 FPS mode, rendering at 4K, you get a similar 30 FPS line with no hint of tearing. For visual purists, this is a pretty good pick, but the next mode along, the balanced 60 FPS mode, is where PS5 really shines for playability. At 60 FPS, it's again practically rock solid with scarcely any signs of tearing. The icing on the cake for PS5 is of course the offering of 120Hz. It's a luxury, you'll need a supporting display, and you'll have to accept a drop to 1080p. But for a rally game where milliseconds count on a lap time, it's a sensible option to pick. The state of performance at 120fps is excellent too. In my limited testing, every stage ran perfectly at 120, giving us this flat line right at the top of the graph. Perhaps the solid optimization here is owed to the fact WRC 10's built on last-gen systems as well, but it works. Now, there is some screen tearing at points, notably around the Japan Shitara stage, but other than that, the high performance mode delivers in spades. Clearly, WRC 10 is a stretch for Switch's capabilities, and that's fair enough. Personally, I love ambitious port projects. Games like The Witcher 3, Wolfenstein, and Doom are still fun on the go. We know going in none of these will be the premier experience, not by any means, but at a bare bones level, those games all still impress for just existing on Nintendo's handheld. But then we have another breed of Switch port, ones that cut the experience just a bit too far back to enjoy, like WWE 20K18 or Ark Survival Evolved. WRC 10 gets a lot right compared to those games at least. In performance terms, it's generally acceptable at 30fps on most tracks, which is a success. The car detail, the on-track handling, translates surprisingly well too if you're just looking to better your lap times. The absence of a multiplayer mode is a shame, but the core mechanics for a race are all intact. So for all the visual downgrades, and they are severe in places, the results at least appear to put a priority on 30fps performance. So, is it as bad as people say? Visually speaking, absolutely. WRC 10 is very rough in places. More so than many ports to Switch, the end result is wildly uneven, lopsided. The textures pop in, the low-grade meshes, the blocky shadows. Some tracks look acceptable next to PS4, but others are unrecognizable. In every case, there's also a general disconnect between the high car detail and the murky fidelity of the terrain itself. Especially on a big screen, it's hard to accept it, the bare bones look of most tracks. Overall, I'd be hard pressed to recommend playing WRC 10 with Switch connected to a TV. It's just too far removed from the baseline quality on console, but there is, I've got to say, a redeeming value in playing handheld. Just about. The resolution is low at around 480p, the frame rate drops at times, but still, it puts in a fine rally experience, especially on the go. With a tweak to the frankly nearly unusable default controls, there is a game worth playing here. Mechanically, WRC 10 is sound on Switch then, but its visuals could use a serious tune-up. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.